we'll go through a few quirky features here. The first one being, if you notice, the radio is on the passenger side. And so when you sit in the seat, there's actually no way to actually change the controls. The other thing you'll notice is that there are two switches here on the dash. This one is a rear fog light, which doesn't exist, and this one does nothing. And so each of these things is sort of, no one knows what they do. The other thing to point out is that it doesn't have normal latches. To latch and unlatch requires these screws, so you need to carry a Phillips screwdriver with you at all times if you want to open the hood of the trunk. And when I say trunk, there's really nothing there. There is no trunk. And so the only place you actually have for storage is behind the seats, which, as you can see, is actually not any room for storage. So what are some of the other things that I would look out for if I were buying a Noble again? Well, a few things. One is the paint is incredibly soft, and so it actually chips incredibly easily. And so when I bought this car, this lower area here, these are just bugs you see here, but this lower area here was all chipped up. And it had the factory clear bra, but the clear bra has these gaps. And so the car looked like it had just been sandblasted in those gaps. And so I had the hood repainted here, and then I had the whole car covered in this clear film, and you can sort of see little elements where they split the wrap. So here's a little seam here that you could see, but it's overlapping. That's why you have that seam there. So it's good. It's not the best job ever, but it helps protect the paint. The other thing too, and this headlight has just had it, but these headlights crack because they're sealed units. And once they do crack, you'll get a little bit of fogging in the light, and you'll think, oh, that's no big deal. I'll just pop the lens out, and the lenses are easily available. But the issue is it takes 10 to 12 hours to get this Sikaflex bonded material off the back. And so getting a replaced headlight is actually takes a long time to actually get right in terms of labor. The other thing, these wheel bearings are pressed into the rear hubs, and they actually need a lot of torque to hold them into the rear hubs, and so they're not always done up properly. And if that's the case, you can get a little wobble and destroy the wheel bearing. And so I've destroyed this wheel bearing once. The hubs are a very expensive, difficult to replace part, although the bearings are easy. And so as soon as you notice this going, they have these upgraded nuts that you can put on, and then you just have to make sure they're done up to the spec torque, which is like 350 pound-feet or something quite big there. We talked about the engine upgrades earlier that I do. Those are pretty normal. The other thing, there are some wiring issues in the car, and so the harness, one of the main harnesses takes a pretty hard right turn here, and if you look right here, there's a turbo. And so all these things can heat up quite a lot. And so if the wiring's not well secured, or it's just aged and cracked, then often you'll get shorts that happen as a result of that hard right turn. So that was happening on my car initially. The other thing is the alternator wiring is a weak point, because it's basically in this harness that also goes by the turbos. And then two, it's sheathed within a sheath, but the material they used kind of cracks all over. So at one point, the whole car shorted out and blew its main fuse, which is located over there, because of all this. But all these things are actually cheap to sort of remedy. You just have to know what you're getting into. And the more you can buy a car that's had miles and or that people have known to sort these things out, the more reliable the car will be. Okay, cool. So no one asked, but how about asking about the engine itself? If you can see here, the first thing you notice is there's just a bunch of tubes everywhere. Literally everywhere. Tube, tube, tube. And that's because the car's twin turbo shoved in this tiny space, but then they put the intercooler far away from where the turbos are because it has to get cool air from somewhere, and it's in the middle. Incidentally, it actually doesn't get that cool air from the scoop because the scoop is so far removed from airflow, so things can get really hot. The good news is the car does make a ton of power. It needs some really basic upgrades, but this one has a larger 3-inch exhaust, and these are pretty readily available, or you can build your own for not too much money. And then this car has 2 upgraded turbos. One of the things to look out for is that like the basic Noble upgrades have been done. And so here you'll see the stock pipes were not all hard pipes, and so there's this hard pipe upgrade kit. there were two choices of intercooler when you bought the car, and so you could have a thinner diameter one. This is the thicker one, and there's even a pro alloy one, which is even thicker and better. And then the exhaust and the fuel system need to be upgraded in order to make any more power. The factory system has this Y pipe that is actually really restrictive. And so a car that's had all these things done is generally probably looked after. A few other things to watch out for. The factory cable, the end of the factory cable was actually just this frayed steel line. And it took kind of a strange turn to where that fray will eventually break, which happened to my car and left me stranded. But there are upgraded cables, and there's a way to remedy that later on. But, you know, when all is said and done and you have everything set up, this car made just under 500 wheel horsepower. No reliability issues since then. And there's two fairly well-known Noble tuners who will help you get that power. And so there's a gentleman in Florida who's named Troy, who's like a Noble tuning expert, and then there's a shop called Turbo Hoses in Northern California that also does tuning that can really help out with drivability to ultimate power. Okay, so on to the next question. Is it practical? Well, not really. You can't store anything inside, and in case you thought there was some way of storing things up front, there's literally nothing that you could store up here. What could have been a trunk is instead a air outlet for the radiator, and so that doesn't really store anything. And it's not really that useful to drive on a daily basis. One of the reasons being the pedal box is really, really narrow. And so you can't actually even have shoes on here if you're a larger shoe size. So I'm a size 14, and I can't actually wear shoes in the car. And so if you plan on using it daily, you know, you could have flip-flops or something, but most work doesn't actually use that. So plan on changing shoes a lot. Okay, just some driving video here briefly. You'll hear a little bit of the blow-off valve, but I'm filming and driving, so it's kind of going slowly here. Here you'll hear the blow-off. And so one of the cool parts is it actually makes a really good sound. There, you can hear the blow-off there. And so it's loud, but it's not too loud, and obviously this car has a different exhaust than normal. But then part of the thing is the acceleration is just brutal on the car. It's about 1,000 kilos, and it's got 500 wheel horsepower, so, you know, 550 to 600 horsepower at the crank. And when you think about that, it's just a car that is tremendously accelerative. And the other thing, being so light, it just feels really light on its feet. So compared to driving, you know, a more modern exotic that has almost 600 to 1,000 more pounds, it just feels very, very different.